Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Voltron Online podcast. This is going to be our Season 6 review podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Avatar The Last Airbender Online.com. I'm going to be your host for this podcast, Morgan Airspeed Prime, site super moderator for that website. Joining me on the podcast is just one other host, and that is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So yeah, that's the two of us for today, reviewing Season 6, the 7 episodes that we got for this season. And the way we're going to do this podcast is we're first going to start with some kind of quick general thoughts on the season, kind of our watching experience of it, what we felt of the season, I suppose, as a half-season thing that it is, kind of more or less, from Netflix. And then we'll get into the kind of spoiler topics, discussing in-depth each element of the season. So yeah, we'll start with that. Usually we'd start with like, oh, what's it like watching all 7 episodes at the same time, but I think we're used to that at this point, and the question more is how does this season work in this kind of unique release format that they have, where they're calling this Season 6, but we basically know it's the second half of Season 4. So Greg, what did you think of Season 6? Did it kind of stand on its own, or did it very much feel like a continuation of Season 5?
I don't know. I think for me, they seem. I mean, I don't know. You can tell that there's more to it, but I mean, with there being, a decent amount of gap in between them, it starts to feel more like its own thing than it has to be sort of part of the other one. I guess if I had watched the previous one more recently, it would feel more like it was, more connected. And when I think back to the episodes, I do see how it is, just essentially part of that. But, I think as they have gone on and on, it does stand more on its own. I think the way that I watched it this time was I did actually watch this one, I guess, in 2 viewings, you could say. I watched the first 3 episodes, and then I took a break at one of the episodes that I guess we'll talk about later on, and then I watched the rest of them after that. So I watched it, I guess, over 2 days instead of just in one big go, which I probably could have if I really wanted to.
Yeah, I did it fairly similarly, because I do like initial reaction YouTube videos. I just decided, okay, this 3rd episode seems like a built-in breakpoint, so I'll just review these first 3, then I'll do the next 4, and kind of little did I know what I had ahead of me in those last 4 episodes, but that worked out quite well for me, kind of taking a break, which was only like an hour or 2 to record a video, but it was still something where like I had a bit of speculation in that video. As for if it works on its own as its own season, I think there's definitely an element of, I think at this point they know what way the episodes are being released, so they sort of write it in a way where there is sort of a starting point after like the mid-season finale. Because I think one thing with Season 5 was that the last episode felt like it was kind of like, okay, this is something big is happening, but it didn't necessarily feel like a season finale, because it was kind of like, okay, Allura has this power, but like, what is it? Like, where do we go from here?
Yeah.
Like, the cliffhanger of like Lotor not doing it was kind of like cool, but there's still more to come. And then I think the other thing that really led me down the road of kind of feeling that this season kind of felt like, okay, it's very connected to Season 5, was just some of the elements in the early episodes here that sort of were just there at the start and then kind of left, like Semdak only being in the first episode, and Hagar basically only being in like the first, like only being a small factor in the season as well. So it very much felt like the big Lotor season, kind of when you really put it all together. Yeah. But overall, I think it works. I don't mind it too much, but I just always keep it in the back of my mind that we are still sort of building off last season, because like they still do it in like a 13 episode season kind of production way. But the one thing that this does mean is that I think the show is scheduled to be at least 78 episodes long. We're at 52 right now, which means there is the equivalent of 4 seasons still to go. So we're at least going up until Season 10, but it's realistically like larger Season 6. But so that's an interesting one. But yeah, let's get into our initial thoughts on the season as a whole. Greg, overall, how was Season 6 for you and how it went?
Overall, it was pretty good. I don't have any. I mean, there's a couple parts that feel a bit odd to me, but other than that, I think overall, I think it was a pretty strong season. I think it's probably one of my more favorites out of the past season, especially the way since they've sort of been breaking things up. So I think it definitely, for me, for the most part, most of the episodes work well for me overall, and the different sort of set pieces and the action that they had going on, as well as getting a bit more history and backstory out of some characters, despite maybe some odd ways of actually telling those stories. I think for the most part, worked well for me enough for the season to actually be, more of a positive than a negative, as opposed to some other seasons.
Yeah, I definitely liked it as well. I think season 5 and 6 together have been fairly consistent, whereas I think before we've tended to go a little bit back and forth, where like season 2 is not the best, season 3 is actually really good, season 4 not the best, and 5 and 6 have now been fairly consistent. Wasn't perfect in that one of the episodes here was kind of like, oh, it was fun, but like I'm not really sure what the overall intent of it was. And then something I've just noticed across, like thinking back across most of the show, they do have a slightly weird way of going about revealing some of their kind of bigger plot points once they commit to them. It feels like it's just a little bit rushed, like nothing huge, but just an element of like they set stuff up so well. There's so many mysteries going into each season, and then there's just a sense of when they finally commit to doing it that it's just a little bit rushed in happening. They don't quite give you enough details, but it's done well enough where you can get behind it. So that's, I suppose, some of the stuff we'll be getting into as we go through it. But overall, I did really like it because they did commit to a couple of the big plots here, and there's some very notable stuff here. And I think just the general fandom reaction to the season has been fairly okay, with the only real negatives I think coming from the kind of hardcore shipping side of the fandom being concerned that the show has actually shown some ships, and it's sort of hit some of the other ships quite hard, but we'll potentially discuss that later on. So yeah, we'll get into discussion topics now, and again, this is where like full spoilers obviously. Greg, what is the first topic from season 6 you want to talk about?
Sure. I mean, I guess I'll sort of start us off with just really the beginning episode, but it's sort of more so, I guess, learning more history about the Gara Empire and just sort of, I guess, sort of Hunk specifically, just his sort of involvement with that, which is primarily in the first episode. But I don't know, I think it's good since we rarely seem to talk about Hunk that we actually get, at least a little bit more out of him this season. Probably not as much as we really should need, but I think, overall, we definitely see more of his highlights this season than any other that I can really think of.
Yeah, he's definitely been the character who's been the most lacking so far. They gave him this first episode to sort of lead the big action set piece at the end, and then have a little bit of the character stuff, being interested in learning about the Galra culture, which worked well with the kind of setup of that he's learning all this stuff. He's not particularly interested in it, except he wants to know what rapid saw means. He learns what it is, and then ends up using it in the action set piece at the end to get the two arguing commanders on his side. So they gave him a cool moment that like he can lead the team on these sort of like engineering missions, but that was about it. It wasn't really like about his character as such, in that the stuff he used, like realistically, like you could have replaced this arc with any other character and it works more or less the exact same. So there's still that sense of like, I want Hunk to have an arc himself about what he's going through. Like we haven't really addressed like Shay and that potential like relationship that he had with her in a while, so maybe where we're heading into the next season he'll get a little bit more time. But I do appreciate them doing this here, at least giving him something, even if it's not the biggest thing, because he has been a bit left out recently. As for the history that we get, again, it's one of those moments where like I almost wish they'd shown like cut to a little bit of a like showing us a little bit of this stuff, like cut to the past just for a couple of seconds instead of just a character saying this stuff. But learning that, of course, we know the Galra are from Dibazal, but learning that they were actually just one of many races, one of many warring tribes on this planet, and the Galra people executed this spear-like attack which they call the killing thrust, which is, I think they basically just say it's a direct translation of rapid saw means the killing thrust in their language. So that's a pretty cool thing to just get across the warlike nature of the Galra people. But what were your thoughts on Hunk and this Galra culture plot in the first episode?
Yeah, I mean, I think like you, it's a nice bit to get, Hunk, I guess, a little bit involved in the story, and he's always sort of like reluctant to sort of do things, but then he sort of gets, pulled into them. So you definitely can see, that bit of his character here, even if it doesn't sort of, I guess, develop him like sort of greatly over time. I think, I don't know, for some reason I feel like, maybe now that, they're going back to Earth, maybe he'll have a bit more involvement, especially since, he does tend to lead things when it is specifically sort of more engineering, more technology sort of focus, and with the whole, I guess, sort of rebuild the castle, maybe he'll have more involvement in that. But yeah, I think it's, it's nice to see him just sort of have some sort of moment in the sun, I guess, for a little bit in these episodes. It's definitely, not enough. There's no sort of arc with him. There's no sort of like bigger overall sort of arching thing like we've had with some of the other characters, but maybe it's the start to something more.
I suppose sticking with the first episode, one of the things that's kind of, I suppose, mainly focused on the first episode, gets a little bit of attention later on to get some of the plot stuff together, is that they reveal more or less at the same time a little bit more about like what exactly is going on with Shiro, but they kind of reverse it as well and also kind of use that to basically reveal what's going on with Hagar, because she obviously found out where Orion was at the end of last season when we were kind of wondering, like, is she just going to go there? Will she arrive before or after the others have left? And we find out that she does go there on her own. She gets in, and we basically find out that she does what effectively Lotor and Allura did from last season. She goes through all the different traps and stuff like that, fights the I suppose lets the white kind of lion, kind of wolf, kind of kill her, and that unlocks her the power that Allura has of like basically Altean alchemy. So we find out that happens, and it's also further confirming to us that it is more of a direct connection thing, that Hagar has this at least ability to look through Shiro's eyes and have some control over him. So what were your thoughts on this kind of being more heavily looked at in the first episode, Hagar and Shiro, this connection?
Yeah, no, I definitely thought that was interesting, just to sort of, I guess, get that perspective and see, how Shiro actually has to sort of deal with this whole sort of like, conflict. And it's interesting just seeing how that, I guess, sort of just develops over the whole course of the season. I think is one of the more interesting, I guess, sort of through lines that they have, that they continue on with. But yeah, no, it definitely was something to see, Hagar figure out, all of these secrets and just basically become, have the same abilities as Allura has at this point. So yeah, no, I think that definitely was interesting to see how that was all dealt with.
And what's your next talking point?
Sure. I mean, I guess I'll just continue with that and just the whole idea of just Shiro this season in general, just his, his character, or his, I guess sort of hidden character that we sort of find out about him.
Yeah, this is, I think it is probably the biggest talking point for the season in terms of like a big dramatic moment. I think it is probably the more impactful one, even than the big battle at the end, of just having this finally revealed. And I suppose the core of it, like it covers a couple of different episodes, but is that, okay, the theories about him being a clone is actually true. There are multiple other Shiros out there, and there's still some confusion about it, which we'll discuss. But the Shiro that we've known since season 3, since the start of season 3 basically, has been this kind of clone Shiro, and that original Shiro, his body was destroyed in some way by the energy of that fight with Zarkon, and his actual consciousness or essence, whatever terminology they use for it, has been within the Black Line since season 2, and that more or less explains, I suppose, why the Black Line has kind of allowed itself to be piloted by a different Shiro, by Keith, and this sort of stuff. Plus, it explains the Lance stuff from last season. And the end result of all of this is that obviously Keith fights this kind of clone Shiro. He ends up defeating it just about in the end, and takes the clone back with him, because obviously there's confusion about like still what exactly is going on with it and stuff like that. But the end result is that Allura at the end of the season uses her powers to take the essence of Shiro out of the Black Line and put it into the clone body, which is still alive. So Shiro gets his body, but it's actually a clone of Shiro, but he's back and his hair is now all white instead of like partly white. So definitely kind of, I think the fandom like basically predicted all of this, but perhaps not all of it like together in this exact way. But I suppose just in terms of the core like beats of what happened, what were your thoughts on it being revealed to be the clone thing, and I suppose Shiro actually surviving the book in a sort of kind of confusing, but he survives the book, the season.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, he does sort of survive in some sort of way, which I guess, he is a pretty good character and pretty popular, so I guess it would make sense to sort of keep him around in some way. But yeah, no, I think it's definitely interesting that, definitely the clone theory has been thrown out there, and maybe it's just because of, that was the theory once before in another series as well. So I think that's funny that did actually come to fruition in this season. So yeah, no, I think that it definitely was an interesting reveal just to see, sort of all the other Shiros sort of lined up there and the way that they sort of reveal it. I think they definitely, did a good job of showing, just that whole sort of situation, and just, I don't know, I think it definitely was a good way of just explaining it, just enough so that you can sort of understand it. I mean, they do actually say clone once when he comes back or whatever. So yeah, it definitely is interesting. I think I like how they went about sort of, I guess sort of bringing him back. The fact that his essence was sort of stuck in the line sort of makes sense with what they've been planning the whole time. I mean, you remember the whole point where he's trying to talk to Lance in whatever the mind space of the lion. So, they've kept, that through line going enough that it doesn't seem, so far out in left field that it's like one of those like improbability type sort of things. So no, I think for the most part, it works for me. I don't have any sort of main issues with that. I'm interested to see sort of where they go from this, if he's, still going to be a pilot or if he's going to be in a different capacity. So, I don't know, I think there's definitely, a lot of different possibilities that they can go with it now, and just sort of like even like how is he going to get like another arm, or if he's even going to do that, or so there's definitely a lot of different things they can do with that.
Yeah, like I think what was presented here, I did like. The Keith Shiro fight, which we'll discuss, I suppose, a bit later on, was very impactful as like the main scene covering it. I think if there's any problem, it's just that I suppose for this season they basically just gave us the bare minimum of information on it. They resolved it in terms of like Shiro himself, without ever really explaining like the details around like. Okay, he's a clone, but like, what's the deal with the clones? Like, why was he cloned? There's obviously a Hagar connection here, and because she wasn't much of a focus this season, it meant that we didn't get, I suppose, her revealing why this was the case, and so on. So it's just like, okay, we know Project Coron is whatever this cloning project is. We know there's multiple Shiros, but their fight seems to more or less destroy the facility with all the clones. So I don't really know if that will come back, which makes me wonder, like, will they or won't they ever explain what this project is? And then, because Shiro's now in the clone body, does Hagar still have potentially any sort of connection to this new Shiro? And I think because of that, there's just a few too many questions, and Hagar and the Paladins aren't really together right now, so I don't really know when we're going to get those answers as such, because the question that I have is probably the biggest one is, like, when did this cloning happen? Like, they have to, I think they imply, just because they say that, like, okay, I died at this moment, that at the end of season 2, that it had to be when he was captured in the first place, which is before the series even begins, with the whole Kerberos mission, that he was captured there. He fought well in the like gladiatorial arena, and because of that he was cloned. They don't tell us this, but I think that's the logical way to take it. But like, why him? In that, like, it ends up working out really nicely in that he ends up becoming a paladin and then becoming more useful. But like, I think they actually have to explain what the Project Quran was actually about. But what are your thoughts on that, of them giving us like the personal side of things in terms of like how it affects Shiro, but not actually explaining the details of who actually made all this happen?
Yeah, no, there definitely is, a lot of sort of questions as far as just the whole point of him being cloned in the beginning, which, yeah, I mean, I don't know, it seems like it is just because he was doing good in the gladiatorial fights, or because maybe he's a human and that's just sort of like unique in itself to, I guess most of the other sort of alien races at this time. Maybe that sort of made him sort of stand out from that point of view. I don't know, it definitely does seem sort of kind of odd because, it's not like, I doubt they predicted that he would become sort of a paladin and that this would be, completely, so useful for their end sort of goals here. But yeah, no, it definitely makes me wonder when we, if we will ever get, sort of those answers. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm assuming Haggard's going to come back in an important way in one of the next couple of seasons, and them being on Earth, even if that is, in theory, far away from everything. Now Haggard can actually sort of, warp everywhere essentially. So it's not like she has enough ability if she has, some sort of forces behind her, or maybe she reclaims it, or maybe she, gets back with Sendak or something like that, where they can all definitely come back together where this story could be told. Although I don't know, I guess it really depends how sort of like important it is to sort of like the story at large. I mean, now that Shiro is back, is there, I don't know, is there a reason? I don't know, maybe we'll find out more of what actually, went down when they were actually captured originally. Now that they're going back to Earth, they can actually talk to their father and actually sort of, find out, more information about that whole period of time that we don't really know that much about in general. We just know that they were in fights and, he was eventually able to sort of get out somehow. So there definitely is, a bit of questions that can be answered there for sure.
And I suppose we probably should discuss as well the reveal when it happens, in that after their fight they end up sort of within, both Keith and Shiro end up within the consciousness of the Black Line, and this is where the reveal comes out that Shiro literally just tells Keith that I died, like my body was destroyed in some way. And I think in a way that ends up kind of being this really weird moment now, where like the disappearance of Shiro at the end of season 2 was actually him dying, and just like, how does that work? Like, it was just that they did the giant was this the giant flaming sword attack that they used to defeat Zarkon at the end of season 2? And he activated the Black Bayard, I think, for the first time, and
Yeah.
then just disappeared. Like there's something specific about that. It was like, it was that how like they cloned him in some way, where like they just like did something during this moment where like they took his body and cloned it at that point, or was it earlier on? And it ends up kind of, I think, being the thing that really puts you off the scent, because it's just such a weird, unexplainable thing that they interpret like, oh yeah, you died, and the way you died is that your body just like seemingly disintegrated just in the blink of an eye. But what were your thoughts on just like the character literally admitting that, yeah, he died?
Yeah, no, it's definitely not something that you expect to be told by the character who has died. And I don't know, I mean, I guess that moment was, pretty impactful when it happened, but I don't know, with it being, I guess, sort of not, I guess, sort of as clear as it could be, and the fact that eventually he did, they did find a Shiro, is, it doesn't really, I don't know, it definitely doesn't feel sort of, I guess, as clear as it could have been. That's probably one of the more weaker elements of the whole sort of him and this whole sort of clone thing situation going on, is that it's just, there, it definitely does feel like there could be, definitely more to it, or more explained. Because, yeah, I would always think that, they had this plan of cloning him from, before this whole situation of him becoming, a paladin, rather than in that moment being able to do that, which I don't know, it just seems like that's not something that would have been a high priority. I don't know, maybe Hagar always seems to have her own sort of side goals that are even different from Zarkon or anyone else, so maybe it was in that moment, but it definitely doesn't come across that way to me, at least.
And then, yeah, we should discuss, I suppose, the future of the character in a way here, because Uh, like it is weird to think about it in that, like, okay, the character we've dealt with for the past 4 seasons actually hasn't been the real Shiro. So while I suppose technically we've gone similar amounts of time of knowing each of them, because even though it's like 2 and 4 seasons for each of them, the first 2 seasons were longer, so the same number of episodes we've known both Shiros. Um, so our original Shiro hasn't actually gone through all of the experiences that the clone one has, but the characters thought it was the original Shiro, and he was still there, just within the black line. So they probably do need to explain a little bit about, like, of the past like couple of months since he died, how much is he actually up to date with about what exactly has happened? Is it everything or just a rough idea of what's gone on? Um, I don't think that will be too big of a problem, just because Shiro has always been the more, like, he's been the fully developed character from the get go. Like, he had his development in terms of, like, being the Black Paladin versus Zarkon in, like, the early first 2 seasons, and that was his arc. And I don't think we really need to do all that much with him more. So I'd sort of lean in the direction of, like, I don't really think we'll see him pilot the Black Line again, and he will just take up the role that he sort of played when Keith was initially the new Black Paladin a season or two ago, where he'll just be the sort of commander. Like, Karan can just, like, run the castle, and then, like, Shiro can just be the sort of military commander of Team Voltron, doing the tactics and stuff like that. But at the same time, as I think a few people pointed out, the fact that, like, the revival of original Shiro gets all of the 5 lines to kind of roar in unison is sort of like a big moment that sort of suggests that he might still be involved in this, but we have one too many pilots still. And given what they did with Keith, it feels a bit weird if we're taking him out again as the pilot. So where do you think that they're going to go with Shiro now that he's back?
Yeah, I mean, that definitely was sort of an impactful moment of having all the lines roar, but I mean, it definitely seems like Shiro's still, he's still not going to be at 100% for quite a while, so I can't see him sort of like taking up the role that quickly. I mean, I don't know, I guess it depends on how long that once, it's going to take them to get back to Earth from wherever they are, which since they can't warp, maybe it will take a while, so maybe he'll be, back up and running for the most part by then. But regardless, I don't know. I mean, I think it's the way that they seem to have Keith going now and not having. I mean, I don't know. I guess it really depends on how much more, I guess, involvement and sort of like the Blade of Remora is in it as well. Because I mean, I guess he could go back to them, but it definitely seems like Keith has now leveled out more so, at least as far as character wise, that he could, he can be the Black Paladin, he can be in a line and, sort of fit that role rather than having to be sort of like, this loner sort of outcast character who's sort of with the group and not with the group at the same sort of time. He definitely seems like he fits in a lot more, at least from the little bit we've seen him now interacting with the team than he ever has in the past. So I definitely would see him sort of staying with the team.
Yeah, just because of what they did. I suppose because of that, I suppose we'll get into Keith. This was mainly the focus of the second episode, Razor's Edge, which I think this is one of the things I always forgot from season 5 is that, like, yeah, they literally revealed Crollia was Keith's mother and then just sort of left it there. Like, we got like a reaction face from Keith, but then, like, dropped that plot point for season 5. And so we come back basically to a plot immediately in progress, which I think that's probably the biggest connection of, like, yeah, these two are the same season, 5 and 6, that we just have to have this happen here. And another case of them doing it in a very unique way. I actually liked it because while the plot I don't think ended up being as maybe complex as I thought it would be, I still liked the emotion and especially the sort of framing device that they used for actually having them like directly see the flashbacks of. They follow. This ends up being a very, like, complex kind of, like, plot progression type thing of, like, because they discover the colony, which is the key thing with Lothor this season. You sort of look back and realize that, okay, so they found this, like, before the series even began. Ranveg and Crollia found this abandoned ship, which is where the super weapon sort of came from, because that ship had a vat of like enriched quintessence, kind of enhanced quintessence, and that was like the core of what that super weapon was. And they want to search for this quintessence because the Blades of Marmora are looking for it as well. And they track this to the quantum abyss, and through the quantum abyss they find the colony. So it's kind of like, is there going to be some sort of reveal with like what the super weapon is, some sort of reveal about where this ship came from? It was a bit of a like trying to like connect it together when I was rewatching this. It was kind of like, wait, is it ever explained like why either of them actually is searching for the enriched quintessence in the first place? Because otherwise it kind of just feels like, okay, they have this like crazy like 2 year time skip thing that happens here for just Crollia and Keith. So they age 2 years over the course of this. But it was with the aim of finding quintessence, but then they accidentally come across the Lotor subplot. So what were your thoughts on what was actually going on here with the plot before we get into, I suppose, discussing the relationship between Keith and his mother and the flashbacks? It's just the plot that was actually happening here, why they went to the quantum abyss. What was your take on what was actually happening?
Yeah, no, it definitely is. I guess a bit sort of confusing. I mean, because you always just think of I guess the enriched quintessence, I guess more as far as just sort of like a hyped up sort of super resource that they can sort of use, to basically do anything and sort of, basically have their stronghold on sort of like the universe. But with having so little of it, I guess sort of initially as just sort of like a taste of sort of what it is, and not really sort of, I mean, I don't know, it doesn't seem like they ever sort of really sort of understand it. And it is interesting that it's sort of like, it's like they have a direct sort of goal by sort of trying to get it, but not really knowing sort of, I guess, sort of why they need to get it, particularly. I mean, they don't even sort of like, it doesn't even seem like until later on they really sort of like understand what it really is when they're actually able to go into the field and sort of, see it for themselves. So I don't know, I think it's definitely, I don't know, it's sort of like a roundabout way of sort of getting to one of the other sort of subplots, even though they're trying to do another one. I mean, I think the way they did about doing it is interesting in itself, but it definitely seems like it was a bit just sort of roundabout a bit, I guess.
Yeah, because like I think like is the implication we're meant to take is that this vat is a vat of quintessence which was extracted from these new Alteans on this kind of colony world, and because it's gone through the quantum abyss, some time stuff could have happened. So like it could have been like hundreds or thousands of years ago that this thing was actually like came through, but it was only in more recent times than the actual show discovered by Ranveg and so on. And that, like, I don't think I can't really remember the exact origin they gave for Ranveg's weapon, in that, like, did he just find it or did he make it with something? But it almost implies that on this like abandoned ship, like another one of these like weapons happened, because it's all kind of wrecked and the only thing left is that vat of quintessence. So like, are they trying to say that like in Lotor's experiments with quintessence on Alteans, he created a monster, and when he was like shipping some of this stuff, it broke free, went through the quantum field, and crazy stuff happened, and that's how it all came together? Because they never address Ranveg's weapon across this whole season. The thing that killed that commander from last season during the Krall's era, it's not mentioned this season. So I'm wondering, will they come back to that, and will they do something kind of crazy with it? In that, for me, the only thing I'm leaning towards is that potentially a known character, like a character that one of the characters knows, has been corrupted by this or experimented on to become one of these weapons. And I'd almost lean in the direction of like Rommel's parents or something like that, but I don't really know how much they want to use her for. So I suppose, do you have any like theory on what they're going for with the enhanced quintessence super weapon kind of plot point?
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't know. For the most part, I almost sort of don't think about it as much. I mean, it had like an important part in the previous season, and it seemed like, I don't know, it seemed like it had like a significant sort of focus, but with them not sort of mentioning it sort of as much, and it's seeming like they're sort of going away from that the way that things are going, I almost don't even sort of factor it in as much unless that's going to be something that sort of like Hager goes back to now that she's sort of like on her own and needs her own sort of like, I guess sort of forces of sort of doing things. I guess I could see that, it coming into play that way. But other than that, I almost don't really know.
Yeah, I think right now the only thing that we're meant to take away from it is that like quintessence when used on living beings in like a enhanced sort of way is has always been said to be this sort of corrupting thing. Um, when you don't do it right, when you don't try and balance it out and stuff like that, that this is what happens. So yeah, getting into the actual Keith and his mother things, it's quite interesting in that you think they're immediately going to get into the answers, but Crawlia wants to get on with the mission, so kind of Keith has to accept that he's not going to get everything explained right away. But when they arrive at the quantum abyss, we find out that it's obviously this crazy place with all these kind of dense stars. They say there's like black stars and all these kind of black holes and stuff like that. If you get too close to it, don't follow the correct path, you'll basically get sucked in and like torn apart by the crazy space-time stuff going on. So they kind of slowly make their way around this thing, and occasionally there are these kind of bursts of, I suppose, time energy is effectively the way to say it. And when they kind of link together, when they hold hands or are in the same vicinity, they kind of experience the past and also the future of what will happen to them. So this is how they go about explaining to us the Keith's origin story, basically how Crawlia met Keith's father, how Keith was born, and I suppose explaining why Galra were on Earth before the start of the series, but why they're not still there and like fully aware of Earth. So it does all of that stuff, and I personally really liked it. But Greg, what were your thoughts on the way they actually went about revealing Keith and Crawlia's backstory, basically?
I think it was pretty good for the most part. I think, I don't know, it might have been a little bit quick at some parts, but I think, the device that they actually used for it of them sort of being, basically stuck together and sort of, you know, essentially being shown each other's sort of, I guess, sort of memories and sort of theories. I think that for the most part worked well. I mean, the way that they had the whole sort of like story of her being on the farm with the father and just sort of that, that whole definitely, it answers most of the questions that we've had, from before. So it's good that they finally sort of, got that out in the open and we sort of know about it. I think, it definitely was more sort of sided on that side versus just sort of, as far as Keith and sort of like what happened with his father from that perspective. I think there's like one flashback specifically that deals with that in the gravestone. So I don't know, I think maybe there could have been a bit more of it, but I think, for what it actually is, I think it definitely was a interesting sort of plot device to sort of get that whole sort of story told and actually sort of show it in a way that sort of, makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. In that sense, it's definitely more of like Crawlia's backstory, and then like a little bit of Keith's. In that Keith still feels a little bit mysterious. In that like okay, he was in the garrison. Like Shiro raised him, which it's always been weird. Like the way I interpret their relationship. Like this made it kind of clear that like no wait, they actually like lived in the same house together. Like that house that Keith is in was the house that they both lived in, which was Keith's father's house, and especially like the connection that a few people have made that like Keith's father's like his action clothes are what Shiro wears. It's kind of like how did this come about? Like the impression I get is that they're all like that Shiro and Keith are like were both orphans and sort of found each other when they were younger, and because Shiro was older, he just kind of helped to raise him in some way. But I don't really know how much they're going to get into it, but it's always been one of those ones where it's not the most like clearly stated like arc for those two characters, but it definitely gets across like the importance to each other of both of them, that it's always been a important dynamic of like Keith being the new leader and Shiro being the old leader, and in earlier seasons Keith never feeling like he's good enough to be the leader when Shiro was the one who was that before. So that they definitely need to cover a bit more. But I did like the core of the story with Crawlia, that they kind of confirm, okay, she's always been with the Blades of Marmora, working with them. Earth was found because it was a plot point in the first episode of the series that the Galra had captured the Red Line, and they were using that, we find out here, to track the other lines. And they find Earth here, but Crawley is part of the scout ships, the two of them. She takes out that guy, but ends up having to crash and is kind of trapped on Earth. She's found by Keith's father, and together they sort of work together to protect the Blue Line, and in the process form a relationship, start a family together. And we see this one incident where more scout ships find the planet, and Keith's father is injured, but they do manage to kind of save Earth for now. And because of the danger that this places everyone in, Crawley decides to leave to sort of from the inside stop Earth from ever being found, which I suppose the implication is that she more or less made that happen right up until the premise of the very first episode, that she kept them off for at least a certain amount of time, but it was found once again. So I think much simpler than I expected, but I did really like the idea for the story of just her protecting the Blue Line from the rest of the Galra Empire, that she was always on the good side, being a Blade. So I think it connected everything together. I think the only weakness is that I hate that I always have to say Keith's father, because the character doesn't have a name yet, which is weird and kind of makes me wonder, like, why wasn't this the case, that they just said something. But I suppose, do you have any more thoughts on Keith's, or sort of Crawley's backstory, primarily, what they actually showed us?
No, I mean, I think, it is, I guess sort of straightforward, but I think, for what they're trying to do and how they sort of, kept Earth off the radar of, the whole rest of the universe, at least, as far as, them sort of finding the lions, I think is, for the most part it works. I mean, I don't know, you would think that, Earth might have been sort of like discovered beforehand just because of, just them, just I guess sort of spacefaring people or whatever. But I can, for them sort of trying to sort of keep people away from Earth. She definitely did her job as far as that goes.
Yeah, I like the idea that they just kind of said that, like, oh, why hasn't Earth been found by the Galra? But and like, oh no, they actually found it like twice. It's just kind of Crawley protected it twice, and she wasn't there when it happened again, which is where the series starts off. So that worked out well. The other thing we get here is that how they get out of the quantum abyss, or like through it, to find the colony, is that they basically get on top of what is more or less the Voltron universe's equivalent of like a line turtle. It's like a giant space whale thing with like at least some land on its back, and it's got its own atmosphere. They get on the back of this thing, and it's weird. It's very quickly done, very quickly said, and it's just like, whoa, this is happening. But they do skip 2 years just for those two characters. Just Crawley and Keith experience 2 years going through the quantum abyss. So Keith actually ages 2 years here. He finds a cosmic wolf which just like crashes out of the sky as like a pup, basically, as a comet onto the back of this thing. He saves it and raises it, and then by the time they come out, it's more or less like a fully grown wolf. And the implication, they don't show too many little flashbacks at this point, but is that for 2 years they sort of bond very closely by constantly experiencing each other's past. So she knows what Keith has been through since she left. The fact that Shiro raised him, obviously, is something she finds out, even though we're not shown that. But she also, the most important thing for her is that she finds out that Keith's father is dead. Hence we see that Keith at the gravestone there. And just the idea is that they basically have their time to kind of completely bond as kind of mother and son here. And while they don't show us everything, the idea is that these two aren't kind of strangers to each other anymore, that they're meant to be like fairly close, fully developed as kind of family basically at this point in time. But still, unusual plot point, because Keith's 2 year kind of time jump thing, it kind of goes back and forth with the animation about like if it looks really clear that he's older or not. Some scenes it's just like, oh yeah, he definitely looks older. Others not as much, because it's a much more subtle aging of the character than you'd expect. But what were your thoughts on them doing the time skip that they did here, and I suppose what we're meant to take away from, I suppose, what they did and why they did it?
Yeah, I think the idea behind it, sort of, and that sort of being like the sort of like bond and agent for him and his mother, Corlia. I think that part I like. That sort of, I guess, the idea behind it and the fact that they're in sort of this abyss. It kind of makes sense. The end result of it, I think, is definitely not as clear as maybe it should be or it could be. It definitely, I don't know, it definitely seemed odd to me. Was sort of like later on, especially like where you see like Lance and the rest of them, sort of like they're sort of like unsure, like it's him, pretty clearly that it's Keith, but it's definitely, it's weird enough that maybe it could not be him. I don't know. It's definitely weird. I think for me it definitely was pretty quick. I almost sort of like didn't really get it sort of like when they sort of came, out of the abyss and everything and they met back up with the team. So I don't know. I think it definitely is old. It definitely is sort of like a subtle aging. Like it's nothing like, I guess the fact that he is sort of, essentially wearing the same sort of gear, it's not like there's anything, majorly noticeable, that really sort of sets him apart as being sort of older. I guess he is a bit sort of like taller, I suppose, or whatever, but it's nothing. I don't know. I guess 2 years, I guess, isn't enough, really. I guess maybe to really sort of like be worth it to sort of like age his character up in a real sort of meaningful way. I don't know. It definitely is sort of odd, at least for me.
Yeah, I think it is just a case of like, I think a lot of people at this point in the series are kind of wanting like, can we get a little bit of like a kind of character design upgrade, like going into like the next season or something like that for like everyone, not just Keith. Maybe them going back to Earth will allow that. They'll get a haircut or something like that, like little things like that. Just like seeing Keith in his like red paladin outfit is just kind of like, when was the last time he piloted red? Like he's the black paladin now. Like they did that arc. Like, can they not just change the color of their armors to like match their lines? Like I get the idea is that like, oh well, they started with this, so they're gonna keep it as the armor they know. But like they've switched Bayards and stuff like that. Why can't they just switch the color panels of their armor to match what they're in? It's just the fact that like most of the team is sort of in the wrong color at this point feels a bit weird. Like Allura's in blue, but she's wearing pink armor. Lance is in red, but he's wearing blue. Like the leader's wearing red, but he's in black, and there's no black armor anymore because Shiro may or may not be piloting ever again. It's like, that's the sort of stuff, and that's where I think like, is it time for them to probably get new suits of armor? I think probably on Earth they'll do that if they're going to make a new castle. Makes sense that they maybe get like upgrades for some of their other stuff, but that's just a kind of more random point. But like, how much do you notice that sort of stuff? Just the colors and the fact that we've switched pilots and lines around, but we haven't really switched the character designs really around all that much.
The character designs for sure. I definitely sort of noticed that. I don't know. Maybe it's just the way that the seasons are going, or the way that everything sort of seems to sort of like flow with each other, because there's sort of like half seasons that there doesn't really seem to be like a huge sort of like breaking point for there to really be sort of like a upgrade on sort of the character designs or however like that. I think your idea of them going to Earth definitely, that definitely seems like it could be a good sort of like catalyst for them to actually sort of be worth it for them to sort of like change their whole sort of like setup and gear and sort of like reveal like new sort of things. I don't know how long they have to sort of like plan all that out, or if like, because that's usually like sort of like a bigger sort of undertaking of redesigning the characters and stuff. So I don't know, with maybe just the way that they're producing the seasons now, that's maybe not as feasible. But I don't know, I think it definitely would be worthwhile for them to sort of like upgrade their character looks. The whole idea of them being in sort of like the different color armors, I don't know, I guess it doesn't bother me as much. I just look at more sort of the characters, and also I think I know that's just like sort of a thing of Voltron in general, is that that's sort of like an irrelevant point, even though you would think that just for like the sake of symmetry that it would sort of match. But I guess it doesn't really matter. It's more so like the characters' personalities and the lines. I guess is really sort of the key point that they're going for there. But I think the characters themselves definitely could work with a new upgrade or new look, even if they don't all sort of like age a set number of years before the next sort of big thing happens.
Hmm. But what's the next talking point you want to bring up?
Sure. I mean, I guess I'll just get it out the way with the whole next episode of episode 3.
Yeah, this is Monsters and Mana. It's a weird one because, like, I don't think I inherently have a problem with them like doing something like this, like a kind of Dungeons and Dragons episode with a reference. I think the problem is just that they don't do enough, like, in like the real world, I suppose, to kind of justify like what this episode is trying to do. In that, like, it ends up just feeling like, I don't want to say it, but like just filler, because the only thing to take away is like it's kind of slightly foreshadowing for stuff, and that like, oh, there's a crystal involved, which happens at the end. There's a betrayal. There's like a big power up for a character. They reference like Shiro's death, just before we learn about it. We get like reference to stuff like Lance doing that knock thing to open the door in the game, which is exactly how he kind of got into blue for the first time through the force field. It's fun for sure, but it just felt a little kind of just a little like indulgent in a way from like the writers and the animators are just like, yeah, we'll just do something different for this episode. And it just, given that there was stuff this season that didn't feel like it fully had the time it deserved, this felt a bit like bad use of time, in that the only real takeaways from it were like, oh, Shiro mentions that his head feels a bit cleared after doing something fun, and then Lance and Allura start to get a little bit closer after this episode, but that's really all there was to it. So it's kind of like, it's fine, but why also as well. And it's something that they've done in a couple of the seasons now. Like there was that Voltron show episode where they just randomly like did a whole episode about shows that sort of felt a little bit out of place, and I think there's one or two other episodes where they've done it as well, and it felt like this was this season's version of that. But how did you feel about episode 3?
Yeah, no, I don't. I mean, the references are nice, and it definitely had some cool like little moments in there, and like some extra sort of like funny bits. Like I like the whole like Allura doing the like superhero landing thing, and like all the other sort of like random sort of references, and Shio's sort of characters, sort of extra bits that you get in this episode. But I mean, for the most part, I mean, they say the reason why they're having the game as far as like the castle's doing upgrades, or other people have free time, or other people are busy, or Shiro taking a mental break or whatever. So like, they give reasons for why they're sort of playing this game, and I like the fact that it does reference Dungeons and Dragons. So it's definitely fun. It's definitely a fun episode in general. But yeah, I mean, it's fully animated and everything, so that's always cool. But I don't know, as far as like the larger sort of story goes on, and I mean, you do see them, sort of hop out of this sort of like fantasy world here and there for them to have like sort of like discussions around the round table, and I guess for a little bit it does sort of bring them closer together as sort of like a team, sort of bonding sort of event and game, which they even mention in while they're doing the fights themselves. So, I mean, it has a point, I guess in the episode itself, but to the larger season as a whole, it definitely doesn't seem like it has any sort of purpose. Like I definitely see it as a filler episode. I don't really see it as like anything really sort of meaningful. Like if you took this episode out of the season, I don't see how it would really affect things at all. That's sort of what I base it on. And sometimes characters need a break from whatever's sort of going on in the series, which can happen. But usually when they do that, there's usually some other sort of like we would get some sort of cut to like what the Gara is doing, or what Lotar is doing, or what Hagar is doing, or something along that lines to show that something else is sort of progressing this story. while they're doing this sort of side thing that's sort of, giving them a break from, the craziness that is, them trying to save the universe, which, you would think they would need a break from that eventually. So, I don't know. I mean, it serves some purpose, but it definitely seems like it could be without.
Yeah, like I suppose the best example of an episode that kind of does this sort of idea right is like Ember Island Players from Avatar, where it's the episode before the finale, so you'd think they only have like a day left before the big final battle, but the characters all decide to go to a play, and it's similar to this. Like they decide to play a game at this moment. They decide to go to a play, but the core is like, okay, there's the humor of the play, but the real takeaway is the characters' reactions to kind of seeing their lives play out on screen, basically. Whereas the cutout moments in this, there's no real takeaways from them because it's very minor. It's just like Lance and Allura are like sitting together and getting along well. Shiro's head, and that's like about it. And then the plot premise for the episode is that they're just waiting for like a random scan to happen, which never comes back. Like they never reference the fact that like, oh, the scan is complete and this is something that the castle can now do or something like that. So it definitely feels kind of unneeded, but it's I don't like hate the episode, but it if we end the entire show and we're missing some time and some plots, like you look back at episodes like this and kind of wonder like what could have been. So it is what it is. I suppose the final thing I have to say about it is Lance at one point makes a reference to like, oh, that must be the size of like a Yalaxian pearl, which is a reference to the first Voltron comic series where they're actually looking for a Yalaxian pearl. And I think when they find it, it turns out to be this like huge thing that Voltron can barely carry. It's like massive. It's like bigger than Voltron. So it's this huge pearl thing that they find. So that was a fun little reference to know that the comics actually exist in the show. Yeah, that was that. My next talking point. I suppose from earlier on this season, we did get introduced to, I suppose, our first proper romance stuff between the characters. Like, we've been sort of leaning towards it a little bit over the last few seasons, but this is the first season where they've properly commit to actually creating a little bit of romance, a little bit of drama between the characters. It's mainly Allura and Lotor, and then Allura and Lance that they go for this season. I actually liked how they did it. It's basically across the first like 4 episodes where they have little scenes between like all of these characters, and in a way it's kind of more of a like Lance's arc. Of course, the plot stuff is Allura and Lotor. The fact that they end up kind of kissing, the first on-screen kiss in the show basically is between those two characters, but then the betrayal happens and we see that actually Allura and Lance get on really, really well, and you're almost leaning in that direction. And he has that moment with her after the betrayal that you could tell that if they are potentially going to have a relationship on the team, it more than likely will be Allura and Lance, but they may not do it for a while yet. But just little scenes like Lance talking to Allura's mice and kind of just saying really, really honestly and openly that he just really likes her and that she being around her makes him a better person, and he later off screen is implied to have like washed all the mice, and they tell Allura this exactly what he said, and that he just washed them without anyone asking them. And like this plus scenes from like last season where like he discovered the sword in the Red Bayard and she helped him with that, and a lot of the earlier scenes here of like he saves Allura when they're hit with this giant energy in the first action scene, and then she immediately jetpacks over to revive him using her quintessence powers. There were a lot of Lance Allura moments over the course of these early episodes, but also Lotor Allura. I think though, looking back on a lot of those scenes, you notice that the dialogue is very similar in nearly every Lotor and Allura scene. Like he opens up with like we've done this together, we'll fulfill your father's kind of wishes and destiny, we're so close, you can make this happen. And they're both just sort of like praising each other for discovering this stuff together. and it's more about like, okay, they're doing this stuff together, but is there actually like the personal connection there? And you sort of realize towards the end that it is more of like him manipulating her, him telling her exactly what she wants to hear, and that being like the core of their relationship. Whereas with Lance, she actually has this kind of close relationship that potentially could be a romantic one. So I was actually fairly impressed with how the show went about doing its first, I suppose, very clear cut romance stuff in the show. I think we've been waiting for a while for it to come in, but they did it well, and I'm wondering will they follow it up in the next season. But what were your thoughts with them committing to the romance stuff for the first time?
Yeah, no, I think they definitely, showed, pretty well how they actually sort of want to go about it. And I think, I think it definitely also just helps that, by the end, Laura just straight up sort of rejects Lotar because of obviously everything that he's done in the past. So, that sort of kills any hope of that sort of relationship there. But yeah, I mean, you can definitely tell it's more of, I guess, sort of like a situational sort of romance of them just doing, a series of things together that sort of, brings them closer together over this, short period of time because, they haven't really known each other that long, so there's no real sort of like huge sort of like foundation for the relationship. It's really just because they've had these very important and serious moments just that have been really sort of like impactful for Laura, just sort of connecting with her people, that has definitely sort of, brought them together, which, you can definitely see, why that sort of would happen here. And, maybe if things had turned out differently, something could have actually sort of developed further from, all those previous situations. But, with that, with the combination of just his sort of like, even if it's not like, fully manipulating, he is, sort of using the situation to his advantage to sort of get her to do, the things that he needs her to do, especially with everything with the ships and everything. And, so there's definitely, it's definitely sort of skewed in that sort of fashion there. And the fact that, Lance for once is definitely sort of more open about his feelings that he has been, sort of in the past. That, he even admits himself that you can definitely see that, there definitely is potential for him to actually have like, a real relationship as opposed to what he sort of has had in the past or what he thinks he's had in the past. So, I think for the most part they went, around the good way of doing this sort of like, love triangle that they have sort of starting here that, clearly has, isn't a love triangle by the end of it. So that definitely sort of helps things as far as, how this relationship, could possibly go in the future. And, will they continue to develop this in the future? I mean, I definitely could see them doing, more sort of hints for this, in the future. I think they're definitely sort of, they're starting something here that can possibly sort of go farther. And, I guess, maybe them being on Earth, they'll have some sort of like side thing where they're together and he's showing her Earth and all that sort of stuff. So, I definitely, there's potential for them to do more with this relationship, which I think, could actually be pretty cool to see how it actually goes.
Yeah, and I appreciate that they didn't immediately just have like Lance and Allura kind of get together immediately after the Lotor thing didn't work, because they even had that moment afterwards, and I like that it was just him kind of saying that, look, it wasn't just you, we all trusted Lotor. I had every reason to hate him for like, because I liked you as well, but I still ended up sort of trusting him as well. It's not your fault, we need you now kind of more than ever. And it was just friendship that he specifically kind of like stepped back from trying anything romantically, but it's still kind of open there because you could tell that she really appreciated what he said. And now that she sort of knows that like he likes her like honestly, because I think like basically from like the early episodes we've known that like he's his like crazy like lover boy Lance persona, like obviously he does this to like every like attractive girl, but to know that like it's actually like honest here is an interesting thing. So I like that it's open here. They've had development and they can get here. It's probably literally just a matter of time of like giving enough time for the Lotor issue to kind of settle down, and then maybe they might actually commit to doing it. But I suppose, Greg, what is your next talking point?
Sure. I guess going along with that, just sort of what Lothar actually did for the betrayal to actually even be sort of an issue. I think that's definitely, a key point to this, that, Lura could never, under any sort of circumstance, actually sort of forgive him for.
Yeah, this was the plot point that kind of came out of nowhere, but worked really, really well because it also served as a little bit of extra backstory on Lothar in that I think I actually re-listened to some of the season 5 podcasts we did, and I think at one point we had a discussion about like are we actually meant to believe that Lothar is the core of 10,000 years old as well, or was he born like way, way, way later on? But
Yeah.
the takeaway from this is that like no, he is basically 10,000 years old. He was born like very early in the like backstory stuff that we have, and to find out that like oh, he knows all this stuff about Altean culture, but is actually in the background found a bunch of Alteans, that there's actually no need to worry about like Quran and Allura being the last Alteans, because there is this kind of colony out there. I did find it weird though that did they ever really confirm that there were more Alteans other than Rommel? Just that they never like in the present day like showed other ones on the planet. Um,
Yeah, that definitely seemed odd, but I don't know. I always got the impression that there was more there. Like, they
hmm.
didn't all get sent off.
Yeah. It was just weird. Like, not even a single like background character was kind of weird that they didn't like show anyone beyond her. But the focus was on her in the backstory. But to find out that there is this colony he created, he's seen as like a god basically on this colony for saving them. And just that he was working from this early stage to make this happen, which I think does fit in with like the backstory we got on him from like last season, where like he mentioned that oh yeah, the reason I was banished by my father was because he put me in charge of a planet and I actually worked with that planet instead of controlling it the way he would want, and it sort of fits in with that. But then you find out the twist that like Rommel's brother, what's his name, Bandor, supported Lothar and always believed in him as the god, but she was suspicious the entire time. And then finding out that what's happened is that he formed the second colony by choosing specific Altanes to go to the second colony, but in fact it turns out that he was basically just scanning them for their potential like strong connection with quintessence, sent them up to what was effectively just a research lab on the moon of this planet, and basically did a bunch of tests. But the core of like what we're meant to take away is that he basically sucked quintessence out of people who had a large amount of it, killing so many people in the process, and has been doing it for hundreds, thousands of years. And potentially it's meant to explain the enhanced quintessence stuff from before, potentially explains why he's like lived so long as well, because like they've still been a bit weird about like, wait, do all Galra just take quintessence to live this long, or are Galra and Alteans just very, very long living people? Because with Zarkon, it's like, oh, he's a monster because he did all this stuff, but Lothar is like basically the same age, but seems fairly okay, seems fairly normal compared to like most Galra people. Um, but yeah, this is the big crazy thing of like, as he says it, he's basically, he did this morally terrible thing with the aim that what he learned from that would help into the future. But it is this unforgivable thing because, of course, he never told Allura the entire time he's been close to her recently that there are other Alteans out there. And just that in itself is bad enough, but then to find out that he has killed not just one or like a few, but thousands over the course of his experiments is just this unforgivable thing, in that it's not the level of Zarkon, but it's the same sort of like intent behind it all, that he's trying to justify having done this and saying that he hasn't really done anything wrong, and that she should find a way to stick through this basically after learning about this. And I really liked this reveal. I thought it worked out really, really well. But what were your thoughts on it?
I think the reveal was done pretty well. Just the fact that, there is this whole other sort of colony, that they aren't sort of the last ones there. I mean, I guess it almost seems, sort of cliche-ish, but I think in this case, with everything that sort of has happened, I think it would make sense that not all of them would be sort of like on the planet, right when it's sort of, is, destroyed. So, it definitely seems like it's a plausible thing. I mean, I don't know, for some reason I would think that over time that there would be sort of like a lot more, but maybe the whole idea of Lothar sort of like doing these experiments and stuff is, essentially keep, the population under control through this, horrible way that he's been doing it. So I don't know. I think there's definitely, some questions there, and I definitely, hope that we do actually get, we actually go back there and actually see the people and sort of, I don't know, get sort of more of an idea of how this whole sort of situation is going to go down, especially since, essentially they looked to Lothar as essentially, their savior, their god for, basically saving them. And, it has been, thousands of years. So, he's essentially brainwashed a whole population of people. So there's definitely, a lot of different things that can, be said to be in that whole sort of situation there. So no, I think it's definitely an interesting reveal, and definitely has, a lot of potential.
Definitely. I think it was a little weird that like Rommel just was kind of there to tell this story, and then was just kind of like there. Like she didn't actually like do all that much. She was sort of roughly helping with what she could when the castle had all its problems, but like she's still there with them at the end. And like I think the implication is that like she was probably going to Earth with them more than likely. So I do wonder what her like direct role is going to be, because they have specifically with her said that like her brother is dead, her parents were also taken at some point, so they're presumed dead. So she is on her own. She doesn't inherently have any like personal connection, I suppose, to many of the other people on her planet, even though they're the same species. So they could have her hang around with our group here. I'm always getting the impression that like if we've got 4 seasons left, 26 episodes, I assume part of the end game of the show would be that they will have some sort of a core relationship in terms of like intergalactic stuff between Earth and New Altea, or whatever they're going to call it. So she may end up like acting as some sort of like envoy or sort of representative between like Altea and Earth, and she just kind of lives on Earth. Otherwise, I'm not necessarily sure just what exact role she's going to play, because they didn't seem to imply that she has any like obvious like skill that is required on the castle or anything like that. Nor did they specifically play up her relationship with any specific member of like the group that she was with. So, I liked the character in relation to the backstory of her kind of being the skeptical one of everything that's going on, but losing everyone around her, and then being proven right, but just the kind of horrific nature of being proven right, and how she wants nothing more than to just see Lothar brought to justice, which happens. But it almost feels like her arc is kind of done now within like 4 episodes. So what are your thoughts on Rommel, how they used her in the season, and do you think there's any role for her going forward, or what they're going to use her for?
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely a role for her. I mean, the fact that she is sort of like a character that's sort of outcasted, via herself from her own people, and just sort of, doesn't have any sort of family relations, means that they essentially can do anything they sort of want with her. Like, they could put her in no relationship with one of our other characters, or she could be sort of, like you said, like the envoy, the ambassador between sort of worlds here. I mean, I don't know, I think, with her being Altain and just being, obviously understanding technology to some degree, more than, your average person, you could suspect, that they definitely can find like a use for her somewhere, somehow. I mean, I don't know, they seem like an interesting character enough with the backstory that they could use her, that she has some sort of some sort of drive, some sort of passion to actually sort of like do something. So I think if they wanted to, they definitely could use her. But yeah, I mean, the core of her arc of finding out what happened to her brother, what's been happening to her people in general, is definitely pretty much completed at this point, but she is still with the group, so she's gonna have, I would suspect that they would have some role for her, unless they're just sort of gonna like drop her off somewhere or return her back to the planet now or something like that. So I don't know. I mean, she seems interesting for the little bit that we've seen from her, but there's definitely a lot more they could do with her.
Yeah. Yeah, I suppose the problem is that, like, because it went so wrong for Keith and Crawley, it's not particularly obvious, like, if they had actually got it right, if it's actually easy to get in and out of the quantum abyss, and if you still have to go through the whole 2-year time skip thing or not. Because, like, it's implied that Lotor could just go in and out, but at the same time, like, he's 10,000 years old, so if it takes 2 years to get in and out, it's not that big of a problem for him. So, is it actually difficult for her to get back home, and will because it's this weird separation of, it's not just a planet really far away, it's like a planet really far away guarded by this kind of crazy part of space, like, can you form that close of a relationship between planets, or will they kind of form a new planet somewhere else and move everyone from this kind of very remote isolated colony back into the actual, like, galactic kind of community in a way. But I suppose the next scene I want to talk about is when Lotor and Allura come back. Obviously this is where they had their kiss. Then they walk into the room and the big confrontation happens. And immediately she's bombarded with a lot of information that she's just had this kind of romantic moment with Lotor and is fully trusting him. Now she's finding out the worst things possible about him, and she's struggling to, like, accept it, but so many of her closest friends and even, like, Karan is there saying that this is true, and the fact that she sees an Altean there who's just as angry about it, she has to believe it. What were your thoughts on how they did this betrayal scene between Lotor and Allura?
Yeah, that's it's interesting how they set that up, and it's always after, like, one sort of like an intimate moment that the characters are having, and of course she has like such a hard time sort of believing it. But I don't know, they definitely set it up pretty well that there's so much sort of like going against him that there's like almost no way that she could possibly believe this. I mean, I don't know, maybe if they had like a stronger relationship to begin with, there could have been more doubt, more questioning on her part. But I think with this, and just her being, she's always been so much about sort of like her people and her culture that anything that seems to really sort of like go against it is just it's just not going to really work for this sort of setup here. And he doesn't he pretty much sort of like admits to it, but he says that there's like some sort of like reasoning for actually doing this, and he sort of wants to talk about it, but it's too much of a conflict of interest for this to even sort of really be sort of considered. So, like, I don't know, it's one of those moments where, like, you could think that maybe there would be some real sort of like doubt here, but it's not, there's not enough build up. And I don't know who, I mean, I don't know, I think we've always been suspecting that we're just sort of like waiting for Lotar to become back to being a bad guy. Like, there's no way that he could stay like a good guy. I mean, it definitely seems like he's not like the worst evil doer in like sort of the world of evil doers, but he's done enough questionable stuff over the 10,000 years that he's been alive that there's something odd about him in general, and this is just sort of like the tipping point for it. And this is just sort of when it sort of happens, and you're just like, of course he's a bad guy, it's gonna happen. So yeah, no, I think they definitely set it up well enough that it works in this moment here, at least for me.
Yeah, and I like that we actually do get like the kind of true anger of this betrayal from Allura, and that she just throws him into the ground and knocks him out, and he's out for like hours basically, like, and
yeah,
gets across how strong Allura actually is, because like I had like an audible reaction when she just threw him like that. It was just like, whoa, that was intense. Like, she didn't just punch him, she just full on like judo threw him into the ground. I think it's one of those things where like immediately the question comes up with Lotor of just like, the second you became an ally of Team Voltron, why did you not like immediately reveal that you have a colony of Alteans out there? and the fact that he didn't shows that he knows that there's kind of wrong, that he did so much wrong in relation to that that he specifically didn't tell them about it. So, him trying to justify it is just that, him trying to justify it, but he can't really all the bad stuff that he did. So, definitely a notable scene there. But what is your next talking point?
Sure. Let me check my list real quick. I mean, I guess sort of going with that. I mean, I guess I don't know. I guess we've talked about Shiro a little bit, but I don't know. I thought it was interesting, and I guess this sort of goes into the sort of like I guess the whole part of just Shiro's sort of like his actual sort of like betrayal here, even if it wasn't sort of I guess his actual choice, but just sort of this moment here of him sort of switching gears on the whole sort of team here, and that leading into later on the virus, and just sort of that whole issue with the castle in general, just it being sort of like this is like the end of the point of the actual sort of castle stuff, as along with what Pidge has to do to sort of bring it back.
Yeah, obviously it was a crazy sequence of events. Like Keith returns, massive reveal. Lotor and Allura returns, like betrayal. Lotor's knocked out. Then Lotor's generals come in, but they're working for Hagar, and like then Shiro suddenly goes rogue. Like so much is happening, and I think that was such a impressive part of the episode, that they had so many kind of moving parts that you were honestly confused, but then when you look back on it, you do realize what's at play here, and that the generals, at least like Oxia, is aware that she's always on Lotor's side up until the very end of this season, but she's working for Hagar here, just to get Lotor out, and this is just Hagar trying to meet with her son again, as she is enlightened in a way, and it just so much kind of drama heading off at the same time. Little moments like no one really knowing how to react to Shiro going rogue like this, because he immediately like KOs, I think it's like Hunk and Lance, and then like they don't really show it much, but like you just cut to him going through the door and he's clearly knocked out Rommel and Allura, which is impressive that he could actually defeat Allura like that. Shows how like powerful Shiro is, that he can do that. And especially the scene later on with like Paige, she has the opportunity to like fire her Bayard at him, but she pauses because she just doesn't know how to kind of react to this. So I thought they did that really well, and just I suppose confirming to us that okay, as part of whatever's going on with Shiro, Hagar does have the ability to like activate like full control over Shiro when she wants to. So kind of confirming that like it's her project and she has ultimate control over it, and the full explanation of it will have to come from her at some point. So I like that. And then yeah, the fact that he did leave behind this kind of virus that comes from his arm, but that Pidge had reluctantly but done it just to be safe, come up with a countermeasure if she ever had to shut down Shiro's arm, and with the idea being that they had to have this like deep down distrust of Shiro, just because part of him is Galra and they're not sure the full details about it, and the sort of dark tones of the fact that like her saying like I can't believe I actually had to use this thing that it obviously is a slightly different way she shut down a virus from the arm, but the idea is that it was there in the first place to shut down his arm if it ever came to it. So pretty interesting stuff. But what were your thoughts on all of this kind of crazy betrayal stuff kicking off here?
Yeah, no, I mean, just the fact that, at this moment was when, Hagar was able to finally sort of get, full control pretty easily. I mean, it always seemed like she was trying to sort of like get control sort of like before, and, he was able to sort of like resist it a bit. But, this is where you really sort of see that, he never really had, any sort of real control over it, or maybe the fact that she, did finally, release all of her powers by going to the place that, now she has like even, greater ability now, I guess, to sort of like flip the switch on Shiro. But yeah, no, it's definitely, Shiro's always been like, the one sort of like constant in the group. So I guess it sort of makes sense that, people would be a bit sort of like, unease on sort of like how to deal with the situation. But the fact that he has always had this Gara arm, and that while it has been definitely useful in many sort of situations, it's still something that the enemy has had some sort of tampering with. So there's some sort of like level of distrust there, if not for Shiro directly, just for something that's on him that never know how it could be actually sort of taken control of. But yeah, no, it's definitely a pretty sort of like deep and meaningful moment there for just the team in general, to see that he has been betrayed them completely, but you still see them sort of trying to sort of get him back, because they have had all of this relationship with him, even if it was sort of the clone part. But they don't really know that at that point that Shiro is, one of the team, despite everything that's sort of happening.
And yeah, we discussed the Shiro kind of reveal earlier on, but I suppose let's actually get to the big emotional scene, the big fight, Keith versus Shiro, and kind of how it all plays out. Probably the most memorable action scene from the season, because we don't often get a ton of like this kind of long fights that aren't just the big Voltron or the line battles. So for one, it was just cool to get a like hand-to-hand combat kind of fight of just them doing their thing with the weapons that they had on hand and the environment, and seeing that like Keith has definitely like progressed. The fact that he's older now, he can kind of physically stand up to Shiro a bit more better than he would have if he was still 2 years ago. Him using his kind of obviously big Galra blade from Krallia well, and obviously using the stuff that he has, his shield, but then Shiro of course just having the raw power of how powerful his Galra arm actually is, him having the advantage of knowing where everything is. And it's a huge set piece battle, like they go all over the place. There's a lot of movement in the fight. There's actually only a couple of sequences where they're actually like directly fighting. A lot of it is just kind of moving from place to place, but it eventually comes down to, I thought, a very confusing moment how the fight actually came to an end, of just like, wait, where did Keith get the Black Bayard from? Where did the scar on his face just come from suddenly? Because I thought they just shot it weird to get across what was actually happening. For one, just because like, okay, like Shiro's forcing the swords down into his face, so I think that's where we're meant to assume the scar came from. But is it just like a Galra marking or something like that? I'm not really sure. And then we saw Shiro throw the Black Bayard at the door, but Allura dodged it. But I don't think they ever showed us visually Keith like returning, picking up the Black Bayard, and then the way they showed that it was actually that he used, I thought was not particularly well done. You only realize it if you like pause it and you see that, oh yeah, that's the sword that the Black Bayard is, and so on. So I really liked it, but the actual final sequence I felt was not, the animation didn't get across the story of what was happening particularly well for me, and I was a bit confused. But the overall emotion of this scene was so well done. It's definitely one of Voltron's like best moments for me. But what were your thoughts on the big fight?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the idea behind the fight itself was really good, and the whole sort of moving set pieces reminds me of like other shows where they have like the whole facility is sort of like destroying on itself. You got these two combatants are still fighting each other to the death. It's one of those big sort of type things. So definitely that whole idea behind it, I think, is definitely pretty well executed for the most part. And Shiro sort of like getting the upgrade of his arm that is able him to basically shoot a beam that could like destroy like the whole place if he really wanted to. was, it's definitely interesting how they sort of used that, and just the fact that by the end of it, that's the thing that sort of gives Keith the ability to sort of like calm him down is by just basically chopping it all off completely. So yeah, no, I think it works as far as like this being like their sort of like moment together that they have here. Yeah, I mean, I definitely do agree that the whole idea of the black sort of Bayard part definitely seems to come almost out of nowhere. I mean, I guess it's not surprising that he's able to sort of like do something at like the last minute to sort of like protect himself. Like that didn't throw me off so much, but the fact that that was sort of the black Bayard that he was able to sort of use there, I mean, I guess it's sort of like showing that he's like the true sort of paladin here. Maybe, I don't know, maybe they're sort of going for that sort of moment here. But no, other than that, I think for the most part, it's definitely a pretty sort of meaningful, impactful sort of like way that they're sort of ending it here, and they sort of have like sort of like the sort of like flashbacks to the past and stuff like that. So you get a little bit of their history sort of together as well here. So they definitely do a lot of that just this whole like season in general, which I think is pretty good to finally get some some more sort of history of the characters, even if it's not really sort of like any sort of like really big sort of development. You definitely sort of learn a bit about the characters, which I think is pretty cool. And it's pretty neat how that sort of like ends the episode right before we get to the whole like next episode where we actually see sort of more information on this.
Yeah, I did like the incorporation of flashback into this as well, that we got to see kind of Shiro looking out for a much younger Keith at the garrison, and I think Keith says something along the lines of just give up on me, I'll go back to the home, is what he says. So is that like some sort of like foster home type thing, or their home? That's where like there's still a little bit of confusion, but Shiro clearly some sort of a guardian figure to Keith at this point in time, and he says he won't give up on him, like, but he also can't give up on himself. And I suppose in present day, this is meant to be the sort of like reverse of that this is Keith not willing to give up on Shiro and just kind of accept that he's just kind of gone like evil and stuff like that. Even though it is a confusing situation with him being a clone, he's still not willing to just leave him there to die, because this is Shiro, even though it is a clone. So I thought that was interesting. We did also get like earlier on, I suppose, the really emotional moment of just like Keith actually saying like to Shiro, like, I love you, like you're my brother. And obviously even that presented a bit of confusion for some people of just like wait, are you literally saying that they are actually brothers, or is it just meant to be like they are so close they are basically brothers? In that like there's enough of like mystery around like we don't know much about Keith's father. Is there a chance that he's also like Shiro's father? But then you realize that like, okay, no, it is just the like brothers more so than anything else. But did that line give you any confusion?
No, not really. I mean, it didn't really seem like they were trying to show that they were really sort of like family relations, or there's some sort of like something else sort of going on with Keith's father. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess it could be possible. Anything's sort of possible, but it definitely, I don't know. It didn't really seem that way as far as how they were growing up. It didn't seem like they were so sort of like close together that they had to be like together. Like it definitely could have been a moment where, if Shiro wasn't the type of character that he was, he could have just left Keith to sort of like fend on his own. But yeah, no, that didn't really throw me off too much, but I definitely could see why it could throw some people off.
Yeah, it's just the lack of, I suppose, full clarity on like the full details on Keith of like, okay, his father died when he was fairly young from what we see of that little flashback. What happened from that moment? Like, when was the first time Shiro and like Keith like met? I suppose is really what we're looking for, which we could actually, I suppose, get coming up, but we don't know yet. So that's that. So yeah, I guess what's your next talking point?
Okay, I guess since we sort of talking about this fight scene, I guess I'll just sort of switch over to the other fight scene with the robots.
Yeah, we finally get, I suppose, the full reveal of those. Lotor gives them a name. It's like syncline ships, I think is what he calls them, or something like that. And that, okay, there's 3 of them now. Lura helps to create one of them. but they all can transform and combine into a three-part kind of Voltron combiner type thing with like a dragon tail type thing on it. Um, Again, this is where there's a little bit more confusion for me of just like, wait, where were the other two ships? Like, were they all in the castle, or did the Lotor's generals always have the other ones? That's where I was like a little bit confused, because Allura, then that means she only performs the like alchemy whole thing to actually turn them into like line equivalents on one of the ships, but does it affect the other ones? It's like, that's where I think there's a little bit of this like throughout most of the plot points this season of like not being clear enough about a lot of this stuff. But what were your thoughts on that? Just like the three ships coming together, and like, were you aware of like where each of them was and like why they're all together now and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I always thought that the other ones had the other ones or the other ships, and there was really only one that was Allura was working on, which I guess could make it seem like weird how they, I guess they could sort of eventually sort of combine. But I don't know. I just always had in my mind from even just seeing the one that they made in the beginning that they would combine, just because that's just how it would work. And then they would of course have a battle after that. I mean, it just seemed like, I mean, they were, they're designed for that sort of purpose, so it's sort of like implied as far as that goes. But yeah, I mean, it definitely is, I don't know, it definitely can seem a bit weird as far as like which ones would actually have the abilities to actually do things, as far as which ones are actually set up, I guess, directly. But it definitely seems like there's one, obviously main one that has like all of the like upgrades to it that I'm assuming is passed through to other ones somehow.
Yeah, like if it is just a case of like the main one, the central unit one that Allura actually did that on, is like the controller, and the other ships are still made of like the alternate reality comet stuff. Like, is it just a case where like Lotor's designs that Allura made just allow the energy of the main one to sort of just be transferred to the other one, so it doesn't actually matter that like the other two ships, which make up like the legs and arms or whatever way it transforms, if they're also able to be the controller or not? Because the idea is, I suppose, that all of the lines are like equal because they're all sort of like sentient in their own way, but Lotor's ships aren't sentient but have the same like power level abilities of the ships, but only one of his is like equivalent to the lines, where the other ones are more of like they don't have like the base energy quintessence thing kind of implied to them as well. But again, that's just like, they sort of lose things a little bit in the details in a lot of these plots, but it still works because it's a cool moment of just like, we haven't had as many big Voltron fights in like this show compared to say like other Voltron shows, or like your standard Power Ranger show where it happened like every episode. So something like this where it's like Voltron against a Voltron equivalent is something we've been waiting for, because like obviously Zarkon had his giant mech thing, but it wasn't really like a combiner type thing. So finally getting our kind of combiner versus combiner was actually really cool to see. And you could tell at certain points they went all out on like the animation for the fight scene, of just seeing how much motion there was up close when they were like clashing with the swords and like doing the really fast moves where they kind of hit off each other and kind of bounced away and stuff like that. I thought that was pretty well done, and like the different transition points of the fight where like they're waiting for Keith to get in here, and then like once he does arrive, and like you have the standoff, and later on in like the second episode they go into the quintessence field and you see all these new powers that we've never seen before revealed, that like eye lasers, the V laser thing that they do at the end, and all that sort of stuff. They really did go all out, and it felt like one of the more interesting Voltron fights, because I think at times some of these fights have felt a little overly the same, that they haven't felt as creative in terms of like the animation and what's going on. But this one actually, I think, had a lot of impact to it, whereas at times, kind of oddly, some of the bigger fights with Voltron have almost tended to be the more dull parts of the show, because the character stuff is so good. But this was definitely something I really liked. But what were your thoughts on the big Voltron on Voltron fights?
Yeah, no, I think that definitely was a highlight moment for me for sure. I mean, just the fact that you get to see, something on real par, consistently on par with Voltron for once, I think is interesting to see how that actually works out here. And, the fact that they are able to sort of like go through, different stages of them, almost being defeated and then, sort of combining to actually create Voltron and then them sort of like almost being defeated again and then, sort of being able to tap into the quintessence field and then that whole sort of situation there, I think is, definitely, even though it is just essentially one big fight that's like essentially like an episode because it's like the second half of the six and then the last episode, the first sort of half of that one. So essentially it's like a whole episode of like a fight there, but there's enough sort of like breaks and different things that are happening that make it sort of interesting and not too sort of boring. And the fact that we haven't seen something like this, before, I think definitely helps. And just, I think the design of Lortar's sort of like robot and how it's combined and how it's so sort of, I guess, agile compared to Voltron, which has always been sort of like one of those things, at least for me, that I always know, like, yes, like it's a big robot, but it's, it doesn't look like it would be the most agile in any sort of like fight. Like it looks like it just should be, it should be, able to move around and stuff, but it doesn't look like, it should be able to do like, crazy sort of like, sword moves or ninja moves or anything sort of like that, even though they're in space where, obviously gives them a lot more sort of like flexibility and maneuverability to actually move around and stuff. So it's nice to see, Voltron itself actually amped up to this sort of level, especially once it's in the quintessence field and it has, sort of like the extra abilities and even how that sort of like affects the pilots. So it has that sort of interesting sort of aspect to it as well. I think is pretty cool to see for sure. So no, I think it's definitely, worthy of being sort of the end sort of fight scene of the season for sure.
Yeah, and I think a thing we have talked about a little bit in the past couple of reviews is just that while I like the stock animation kind of thing for Voltron each time where the music comes on, I also I do think it would add something to the animation of these fight scenes to see a more kind of less stock version of Voltron transforming. Because I think they could do some cool stuff just seeing a more kind of fluid way of like the lines just like flying together in unison and like forming in a certain way to like, like they form the whole thing except like the right arm to like dodge a blast, but then the right arm links up and they do something like more involved with the action of the transformation, whereas it kind of feels like, okay, we're gonna have 4 more seasons of seeing this stock animation again just because it's a reference to like old Voltron. When the show is otherwise so different, it just has different than like previous Voltron, like Power Ranger type stuff. This stock animation is like the one thing they like persist with that I think it's just a little bit frustrating at this point. But what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that the stock animation is worth kind of using each time, or should they try and do a little bit more with the transformation?
No, no, I definitely agree on that aspect that it definitely gets, a bit tiring after a while. And, eventually you learn, I mean, depending on how involved you are in the show, eventually you learn to sort of skip past it a couple bit beats because it's, it's pretty much, it's the exact same thing and nothing has sort of happened. I mean, I don't know, I guess it is sort of like a nice homage to like the original way of doing things, but I don't know, I mean, maybe they could just like shorten it a bit. That would be fine for me. If it's like, it could be just like a weird sort of like production thing where it's just, it's going to take forever to sort of like create that new scene or whatever, so they have to use it over. But even if they just did a shortened version where they just show like the lines sort of coming together and then just cut to it already being transformed, like even that would be enough for me. I mean, I think the idea, like you said, of actually doing something cool where they do have it like, it's always cool when you see that sort of happen where, and they might have done it in the past where like, they try to combine but they can't really do it, or someone actually shoots a blast because that's probably what would happen if this was like a real sort of type of thing that sort of interrupts their sort of like coming together form or whatever. So there's definitely potential for them to actually do other things if they really sort of wanted to, which I don't know, maybe now that they're at Earth and they're sort of rebuilding sort of the whole cast and everything, this will be the opportunity to sort of like try some new things, I hope.
Hmm. Yep, and I suppose the next thing to talk about is, I suppose, the build up to the fight, because we do get this kind of confrontation. Like, Lotor is reunited with his generals, and the paladins, minus Keith, who's still obviously coming back from where he was, have this kind of standoff, and this is where we get, I suppose, the big turning point for Lotor, where he kind of goes pretty much full villain. And it comes down to basically Allura and Lotor talking here, and Allura being completely unable to get past, of course, what he's done to the Alteans. You know, she's very angry about this. You know, she kind of asks, you know, like, how many did you kill? And he is forced to admit that, like, he did it, but he still tries to justify it by saying that, like, by doing that, like, I protected so many more, and I still want to help, that he still believes that together they can do all of this stuff. You know, he says that he has feelings for her, he knows that she has feelings for him, and she at this point realizes that he did just manipulate her, and the kind of turning point ends up being that she accuses him of being kind of more like Zarkon than she could have, like, ever imagined. And I think for me, this is where, like, the weak aspect of this Lotor plot came in, where it just kind of felt a little bit too much like, okay, I get you're kind of having this be the snap moment for Lotor, but he's interesting because he's a complex character. Having him go full evil like this takes so much away from him. So, especially when it's literally just being compared to his father, which has been happening for, like, most of the season. So this moment didn't feel the best, but he kind of snaps and kind of says that, you know, like, Alfor was too weak to defend Altea. He's strong because he did it, and who is Allura to disagree with his tactics? And then just says, okay, wipe them out, fight begins. And that was the turn, and then as the fight progresses, he just becomes more and more angry. You can see how, by the animation on his face, that they're going for, like, the crazed kind of lunatic villain at this point, that he's sort of lost it, and then the quintessence sort of enhances this a lot more. So while I don't think this is the end of Lotor in the series, given where they kind of leave him off with, like, a sort of just imply that he'll probably die from, like, overload or something like that in the quintessence field, I do think we'll have to come back to him. But what we get here, for me, I think they needed to be a little bit more, like, nuanced in the transition from him from being a sort of, like, a morally kind of ambiguous character where you can trust him, but he has done these pretty bad things in the past. So he's meant to be that sort of, like, Zuko type character in a way where, you know, he's been the villain but has changed because of this. But obviously it's a slightly different scenario. I suppose this is more of, like, I think if they tried to, like, redeem like a Zula type thing, where she actually has done some kind of almost unforgivable things, and how far do you go to try and do that? And we'll potentially see that in the Avatar comics. But with Lotor here, I felt they could have wrote this kind of back and forth a little bit better, rather than just, like, she says Zarkon and that just snaps him. When I mentioned this, I think in my YouTube video discussing this, I think a few people, like, disagreed with me and actually really liked his arc, but I didn't feel they ever presented any particularly great point about, like, why it's such a great thing for Lotor. But my hope is just that they haven't just, I suppose, Zarkon'd Lotor here, where I think we're all in agreement that Zarkon was pretty boring as a villain outside of maybe his backstory. But what were your thoughts on how they actually did the full villain turn here, going into, like, the finale for Lotor?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, they definitely make a point of, you know, the comparison sort of being like the straw that breaks the camel back, and, you know, him sort of like being like, okay, well, if that's how you see me, then this is how I'm going to sort of act here. But it definitely seems like, you know, with him being, you know, as we've mentioned before, and like you said, him being sort of like a more sort of in-depth sort of bad guy, you know, having, you know, various sort of motives that you can, you know, almost see them as sort of like being good. It definitely seems like at this point they definitely sort of push him off the edge, which, I mean, they're implying that, you know, him being in the quintessence, which is essentially what happened to his father and, you know, Hagar, that, you know, is sort of like really sort of pushing him, you know, to the max, basically. Like, he's almost seeing or is at the point of like no redemption here, and he has done pretty sort of like horrendous things in the past, which there's almost like no sort of like coming back from that at this point, especially not in Laura's eyes here. So I don't know. It's definitely an interesting route that they chose to take with him to make him sort of go this far. And I don't know. It doesn't seem like he, initially he doesn't go like super crazy. It's not until he's like later on in the heat of battle that he really sort of like seems like he's really gone off sort of like the deep edge here. So I don't know. I think it definitely will be interesting to see, how or if they bring him back and sort of what role he actually plays, or if he has any sort of like ability to sort of like function as sort of like a normal person like he once was after being basically left there in the quintessence field for X amount of time, however long they're going to leave him there if they choose to bring him back. So I don't know, it definitely seems like he could have been a really sort of like more interesting, I guess, sort of character going forward. And he still has potential for doing a lot of things, I guess. So I guess we might have to just see on that one.
Yeah, like I think the way I kind of wanted them to take him here was that I they sort of touched on it here, but immediately kind of had him like just descend into anger. I would have preferred for him to kind of remain calm and kind of continue to just kind of note the point of like, like this is a kind of ambiguous situation here where like I've done this thing that you want, which is saving Altea basically, but people have died in the process, and like kind of ask the paladins in a way the questions of like, are you going to like kill me and imprison me for like all this positive stuff that I've done? Compare me with Zarkon when like who did Zarkon ever save? Whereas I actually have like saved more people than I've killed, and just present him as kind of the really like ambiguous character where like half of your audience could be behind him and agree with him, half of them like kind of Allura just see the negatives and to that, and they're both kind of justified points. I kind of would have liked a bit of conflict within Team Voltron, which you kind of get about like should they save him in the quintessence, but they sort of move past that because it's such an intense situation they have to just leave him there. But have it be just, should they even fight him in the first place? And I would have liked it in a way where like Allura's the one who's angry, and she kind of in a way sort of ends up starting the fight, and that she attacks first. I would have liked him to have played on that he specifically says to like his generals, and he himself doesn't fight back and like makes a point of kind of being like, no, don't fire back, like we're still allies, and almost makes it that like it's Voltron breaking this alliance in a way, and do something with that, and in that he's still kind of doing some manipulation, but he still feels completely justified that his positives outweigh his negatives, and stuff like that. In that, I suppose the fear I have at the moment is that while I think they'll bring Lotor back, what will they do with him once they bring him back? I think the fear that I have is that they'll just have like him join up with Hagar now that they're both sort of crazy, even though they had that kind of scene where they clearly hated each other earlier on. Now they're clearly more aligned, and they're just the two villains instead of the one villain that we had before. Whereas in a way I kind of want to have the redemption of Lotor, because they've presented enough about him where I think he's done like a lot of positives, but obviously his nature, the fact that he is sort of tainted by the quintessence as well himself, there is that kind of back and forth. But has the good that he's done kind of given him any sort of a kind of way to get out of this or be forgiven ever? That's kind of sort of like kind of ambiguity I'd like to see them bring back into things. But what are your thoughts on that? Do you think they're going to bring Lotor back, and kind of in what way if they do?
I don't know. I mean, I definitely could see them bringing him back, but I don't know if I would see him on some sort of like redemption arc. I mean, I don't know. It seems like he's done too much bad to sort of like be redeemed in that sort of way. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I could see him doing some sort of like last ditch sort of type thing to sort of to give himself up to sort of like save the day or something like that, to sort of like try to prove that he was good all along or something like that. I mean, I guess I could potentially see something like that, but I don't know. I can't see him being sort of like a regular sort of like member of the group like he was, previously, not with everything that has sort of like happened so far. So if he does come back, I definitely wouldn't see it be like immediate, redemption or anything like that. It definitely would take a while if it ever got to that point. I think, I would think that he would be, too corrupted at this point to really sort of, be on the good side at all here. It would have to take something really sort of like, I don't know, drastic to sort of bring him back. At least that's what I would think. But I don't know. It's definitely, it definitely can't say for sure, how they're going to go about sort of like bringing him back, since he's just sort of stuck there right now. I mean, I don't know. Who knows? He could have already figured out a way out of there, but it definitely doesn't seem like it's something that's immediately sort of pressing.
Yeah, I suppose the big thing would be that at some point I assume they're going to have to resolve the whole Galra Emperor thing now. That they didn't really address it this season. That like there's now complete chaos in the Galra Empire. Like the actual ruler who a lot of people were getting behind is now missing. Like does the coalition tell anyone now that like the Voltron coalition is allied with the Galra? And is that gone now because of what happened with Lotor? And like how many people know about that? And this is where like, are they actually setting up like just honestly like Semdak might actually be the right character to make the Emperor of the Galra Empire, in that like, okay, he's the villain in like the first season, but like it's one of those things where like, has he actually done anything like truly evil, or has he just been doing things, supporting his nation, and he's just happened to be on the wrong side of things, and he could actually be the right person? Because we're kind of running out of like notable Galra characters, unless you're going to do something weird like Keith becomes the new Galra Emperor at the end of the series, or they just abandon the idea of Emperor and do something like that. But you still need a leader of note, I think, within the Galra, and I'm not really sure who that is without Lotor there, because it felt like, because you'd sort of trusted Lotor, it felt like, okay, we have our Emperor, we have our guy, now he's gone, so what do we do there? And I suppose, do you have any thoughts on that front, now that like this is a plot point that's going to have to be addressed, of just there's now another power vacuum within the Galra, and who is there to lead now?
Yeah, no, it definitely. I mean, that would be funny if Keith did somehow become the sort of new emperor, just because of, I don't know how the situation is going down. But I don't know. It definitely, I definitely can see Sendak sort of stepping in. However they sort of figure out that Lothar isn't sort of around here, and he's definitely, he seems like he's amassed a good amount of forces at this point, that he would be in the position to actually sort of take over at this sort of stage here. So I definitely could see him, being in the force that's going to mount an attack on, I would assume that everyone's going to sort of start to come to Earth now, just because that just seems how things eventually happen, and that, he would be leading that sort of like charge there. But yeah, I mean, the whole idea of them being with the coalition and now not being with the coalition, I mean, there's no one else really to sort of like, I guess, sort of stand up for that whole sort of mentality. And it definitely seems like the whole empire itself is too much on edge for there to be like someone else that's not really sort of like known, unless they just do something completely different, to sort of like step in and take care of things. So yeah, no, it's definitely going to be interesting to see how they deal with that whole sort of vacuum of power now. And I don't know, maybe Hagar will come back into play with another puppet or something like that, but I don't know.
Yeah, that, or like Caliban is the leader of the Blades, like he might have to step up, in given that everything that's happening. But the Blades kind of seem, the Blades seem like anti there being an emperor, based on what they were willing to do at the Krall's era last season, but they just want to blow it up, the whole structure of the thing. So I don't really think they'll go that direction, but we'll have to wait and see. It's just, at this point, in terms of like looking at the end of the series, which is like we're closer to the end than we are to the start, so at the end of this series, like, who is leading the Galra people? I'm still thinking Lotor right now because I think they sort of have to do something with him in terms of not maybe fully redeeming him, but like he feels like the only character they can put in that position, just because like I'm not sure they might have to introduce another character and do this, or else it is Semdak, but I'm not fully sure. But I think they're in a bit of a confusing situation at the moment with that. Let's see. Next talking point, I guess the castle stuff. We sort of mentioned this before, but it is a sort of pretty major plot point for like the second half of the season, that the virus affects the castle and everything is kind of shut down. It nearly blows up because of the Teledov and the virus. They just barely get it back up and running. It takes damage during the battle, but it ends up that after they defeat Lotor and come out, all of these rifts in and out of the quintessence field are like merging together, and they basically say that like they can't stop these things. They'll just continue to grow and they'll destroy everything within the known universe. Like that's how bad things are, and the only way to stop it is to basically use the Teledov, like activate it, overload it right at the moment where the castle goes into this rift. So they have to sacrifice the castle to stop the world ending. So they really treat this as like the death of a character type thing, where they all go in, they all have their own rooms, they take all their important kind of stuff out of it. It goes into the rift, it blows up, but you see this kind of flashback of all the different rooms and kind of like, here's the main room, here's the dining hall, Paige's room, sort of stuff like that. They give it its emotional farewell, and especially like Karan, and that his like grandfather made it. It's a very impactful scene, losing such a notable vehicle, like home, basically 2-in-1, and just having to sacrifice this thing that like they finally, like, I suppose, committed to really like doing something big. They didn't kill off Shiro, but we did lose the Castle of Lions this season, even though we have hope that there'll be another one. And they more or less seem to imply that here's like a diamond crystal thing that might power it. Right now they don't have the castle anymore, and like the last key bit of technology from like the past is gone. So I liked how they did this. They treated it as like a really big loss, but I'm excited to see what a new castle looks like. But what were your thoughts on what they did with the castle throughout this season? Really kind of getting across that like it's almost like technology has sort of advanced past it. It's not powerful enough anymore, and it kind of suffers for that at the end of the season.
Yeah, no, you definitely start to see sort of its limits, which I guess you've been seeing that through sort of like this whole season. Like, I mean, it's, in the beginning it seemed like it was such this sort of like advanced thing that it's a castle that can transform into a spaceship, and you're like, sort of like amazed at the fact that it can sort of like transform this way, and they've been living on it. But as the seasons have gone on, you have sort of seen sort of like the limits that it actually has, and how they've had to fix it from time to time, and how even the season that it was sort of like shut down while they were doing sort of like upgrades and stuff. So yeah, no, I mean, they definitely give it a nice sort of like farewell here, and they sort of like use it to its like best sort of potential that they could have like used it to sort of like to save the whole universe. So definitely it definitely has this place here, and they definitely have like a lot of memories in it, and they do the whole sort of like flashback of showing the different rooms and everything, like you said. So no, I think it definitely was sort of a nice enough. But yeah, I think it definitely will be interesting to see how they do choose to sort of like upgrade it and redesign it, hopefully for like the new sort of like part of the series now. And I don't know, I think that definitely could be pretty cool just to see their new take on it, especially if it's designed at in Earth. Then that'll just be interesting perspective to see how it's blending, I guess, the two sort of cultures together to sort of create this sort of like mobile home base for the Paladins.
Yeah. And it was sort of funny as well to just see like them have to use the lines for like transport of stuff, like just seeing multiple people in the cockpit of like the Lions, like the cow Kaltenecker beside Lance and stuff like that. I can't even remember what they called them, the weird kind of space fuzzy things that Paige has from when she was separated from everyone, I think at the start of season 2, that she's kept. All those little sort of things were just kind of fun to see, that there'll probably be some sort of a joke at the start of next season that like, glad to finally have somewhere else to like sleep instead of the line next to everyone or something like that. But yeah, big impact here. As far as the crystal goes, I'm assuming this is going to get some sort of reveal that it's like a borderline like infinite source of power or something like that, because they say that like the castle like, was crushed by the rift thing into this crystal. So the castle was already powered by a giant crystal thing from the Balmera. So this is like a compacted Balmera crystal, plus it has the whole castle and all the energy within the castle combined with like what is basically the most powerful event in the universe, this kind of like reality rift thing. So the only interpretation I have for that is that this small thing is going to like be able to like power the whole castle and a whole lot more, and this will be the big power up feature of the castle, that its lasers are going to be like all the more powerful just because of this diamond crystal thing. But what's your interpretation of the crystal that they get at the end?
Yeah, no, I definitely could see it being the power source for the new castle. I mean, I don't know, I guess, I could see it having the potential of having more upgrades, but I guess just the fact that it will be this sort of like small source compared to before where they had like the huge sort of like crystal that, needed to power the whole sort of castle. This, I don't know if it's anything like that, then, it definitely would seem like this new castle would be a lot more, I guess, maybe sleeker designed, or maybe it'll be more sort of like functional rather than sort of like being like this whole sort of like home type thing. I don't know, there's so many different ways they can go with sort of like designing that sort of thing. I'm sure that'll be like a fun thing to actually sort of see revealed what it actually is. But yeah, no, I think that's definitely has the potential for a lot of different things, and maybe they'll actually sort of like Hunk will figure out like something cool from it or something like that. So no, there's a lot of different possibilities.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the last talking points I have for the season is just I'm really not sure what I'm meant to really take away from Lotor's generals. So Oxia, Ezor, and Zethrid are the three that's left since we lost that other one like a season or two ago. They just felt like they kind of switched back and forth on sides like 4 or 5 times in this one season, and I'm not really sure what like direction we're meant to take with them. Especially Oxia as like the leader of them. Like I think they give her enough scenes to where like it feels like okay, they're going to do something big with her this season, but they kind of don't. And that like I'm leaning towards there being some level of like romance thing that ends up happening with her, whether it be like she actually like loves Lotor in some way, but I think we're past that given what's happened, or her and Keith, which I don't think they've had enough like just scenes of them talking to lead that way. But there's been enough like you saved me here, so I'll save you here between the two of them that something down the line might happen, because I do feel Team Voltron would have to like probably team up with them at some point for some mission, and they'll just be like allies from here on out in some way, and that Team Voltron are the of all of the players in all of this, they're the ones you can trust, and they've been betrayed a few too many times by the people around them. So I hope they give these generals a chance to shine and not just flip flop back and forth like every season. But what did you make of Oxia, Ezor, and Zethrid's involvement this season, and where you think they'll go with them?
Yeah, no, I mean they're cool characters. I mean in themselves, just because they stand out, they're unique. They're right behind sort of Lotar and sort of like the thick of events. But yeah, they did have so many sort of like I guess allegiance sort of switches here, and two of them didn't actually know what was actually going on the whole time, and the one that did it was just sort of like playing both sides, but eventually told them to sort of like sever ties with Lotar. So I don't know, it definitely. I don't know, they have like a lot of sort of potential as sort of like this cool group of characters that are pretty sort of like capable in their own right, that they could go sort of like their own sort of way, and it would be fun to actually sort of they're interesting to sort of enough to sort of follow along. I mean, we don't have any sort of like really sort of detailed sort of like character motivations with them or anything like that, but they're just cool characters that we've seen around enough that we feel like they should have, some more important role. Like, I don't know, maybe they'll be the ones that sort of, get Lothar again out of the Quintessence field. I don't know, maybe they'll go that route, just because, Axiom seems pretty sort of like loyal to Lothar, so for whatever reason. So I mean, I don't know, there's a lot of different routes they could go with them. I hope they do choose to sort of keep them involved with things, just because they seem pretty cool.
Mm. And yeah, I suppose the betrayal with them happened because Lotor says at one point that I'll take out all of my enemies like Voltron, Hagar, and all of the Galra people. So that's like the big like evil point for him, where he fully admits that like he doesn't actually care about really the people of the Galra Empire. He just wants to rule them, and actively hates them to the point where he's willing to wipe them all out. Which kind of goes in. It makes you reverse the way you sort of see Lotor from before, where like when they were introduced, the idea is that they're his generals because he sort of like brought them in high positions because no one else would give them a high position, because they're like hybrid, like half Galra only, because they're all different sort of species of Galra. So it's more of a case of like he took them in because they're not full Galra like himself, and that's why he chose them, because he actually hates the Galra people for his own reasons. So it sort of switches that around, but I do hope they give them a little bit of focus. But we'll see in the coming seasons what they do with them. I think the only other important scene we haven't talked about is we did get that brief meeting of Lotor and Hagar, his mother, where she full on reveals it to him, and it's interesting because she's kind of like, she basically admits that like, okay, I know exactly who I am now, but because I'm changed, because I am Hagar more so than Onerva now, I don't actually care about you as your mother anymore. Like that's gone, but I can see that you've basically accomplished more than I ever kind of have in terms of what goals I actually want. And it's basically asking him to work together with her, but he basically just says that he just treats her as like the witch Hagar, that she's just a monster to him, and he doesn't see her as kin, I think is the word that he uses. And that's really it. She just sends him away, and that's the end of their relationship, more or less. Obviously you sort of have to reframe that now that sort of Lotor has sort of also in a way become the monster. Maybe that's changed now. But what did you get from Lotor meeting his mother here?
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like, she was really, I guess, sort of trying to sort of like reach out to him in, whatever way that she thought would actually sort of connect with him, now that she is, essentially like reawakened to the way that she was before, or, at least is aware of, things that have happened in the past, and isn't sort of like as consumed by sort of like madness as she was before here. But, you can see clearly that, Lothar, has doesn't want anything to sort of do with her, and is always sort of like had sort of like his ace in the hole to sort of like monitor her in this sort of situation here. So there's definitely an issue that's going to rise there between them, maybe if they ever sort of see each other again here. But now that Lothar is sort of like, or at least as far as we know, is sort of like on the deep end now, maybe they have, I don't know, maybe there's more of a connection now that he's sort of like gone off the deep end. I don't know how that would actually work here, or maybe this will be her chance to sort of like try to redeem herself by getting him back from being too far deep or too far gone or something like that. So I don't know, there's definitely, I don't know, something that they could do here. I mean, I don't know, I mean, the fact that she just sort of like up and vanished when they tried to get her for like half a second there means that she's definitely going to come back. It's not like she's gone forever, it's just how is she going to come back.
Yeah, and the most notable reveal with her over the season is that I suppose technically at least a villain now has the ability to make wormholes, whereas like Allura was basically the only one to be able to do that before. So Hagar has unlocked that, Allura already had that, so it kind of potentially goes back to like their fight from season 2, I think it was, where like we got the whole reveal with Allura that like she's like immune to Hagar's like magic powers. Like I think we probably are ultimately leading up to some sort of a confrontation between Allura and Hagar, using their kind of new powers to see who's better. So when that will happen, I'm not particularly sure. But I suppose, Greg, do you have any final talking points from the season?
No, the only thing that I think is really interesting now is just the fact that where they're going to be starting the next sort of seasons at.
Yeah, so yeah, I suppose that's pretty much the last thing to cover here. That yeah, the end heavily suggests that season 7 we will get to Earth and we'll have some that it seems like we'll be taking a bit of a break from any like intense action and we'll just have some kind of character stuff on Earth, potentially some mild drama with just Earth having to potentially react to just aliens and stuff like that happening, because we just don't know how much the Galaxy Garrison actually knows about everything that's happened here. Like they sent messages back, but like when Sam comes back to Earth, when he got back to Earth, did Earth already know, or like is he the one to actually reveal that like, oh yeah, like our children are actually like leading the fight on this like intergalactic scale, doing all this stuff. Here's their videos, or what? Like those are the big reveals that are going to have to come into play, because like the Galaxy Garrison last we saw of them in like the first episode didn't really seem to know what was going on at all. So humanity is probably going to have to be caught up to speed, whether it's Team Voltron to do that with the help of like the Altanes they have with them. I'm not entirely sure, because we're probably going to have a little bit of a journey to actually get there in the first place, because now that Allura doesn't have the castle, she's probably going to have to learn how to make wormholes on her own in the way Hagar can. So that might be the first episode, and then maybe we'll jump straight back into Earth. But I do feel it's probably the time to kind of just be like, okay, the team can kind of actually split apart for a little bit because we're just back on Earth. Family time with all the characters. We get introduced to like Lance's family, like from Cuba and stuff like that. Hunk's Samoan family or whatever and stuff like that. That's what I'm kind of looking forward to. And then Crollia will be with them. I assume they'll have like a Keith, Crollia, Shiro kind of moment together over what happened at Keith's like father's grave or something like that. And there is a lot to just catch up on. Plus the kind of reverse kind of culture shock thing of just the Altaeans on Earth and how they react to the culture there. That'll be pretty fun, because we got to see the Paladins react to the craziness of space. Let's see how they react to this, and I think it'll be fun. I hope they don't immediately jump back into the whole, what I suspect we'll get to eventually, which is just Earth is under attack from Semdak. More than likely Semdak, because the way he approached things in the first episode, I get the impression that like he'd be the first one to go for, oh, all the Paladins are from Earth, we'll attack Earth to get to them, in the way that his mind works. So I think they'll get to that eventually next season. I'm not sure, because I would like a bunch of episodes that are just figuring out what's going on back at Earth, that aren't overly intense. But what do you think they'll do with season 7?
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely a lot of sort of potential that they could have. I mean, I guess, I don't know, I'm really just looking forward to just a whole sort of interaction of just sort of the larger sort of universe with Earth. I think that's always one of the interesting elements that they have in these sort of type of series, whether they're sort of like receptive to it or they're just sort of like antagonistic towards it and just sort of don't want to deal with it. I mean, just the fact that, this giant, these giant lions that form this huge robot is coming to Earth could be, seem, really sort of potentially sort of dangerous here. And the fact that, most of these, kids essentially were in the Galaxy Garrison, sort of, they were sort of being trained for this in some sort of way, even though maybe some of them weren't sort of like the best sort of like representation of, sort of like, their sort of like elite sort of forces here, but they've developed so much. So there's that whole sort of like set of character interactions that they have to go through with, the people that they previously knew on Earth and how much they have grown in time. Like, I'm sort of like just curious on like just sort of like the time scale of things, of how long things have actually sort of been since they've left, and that whole sort of thing here. So I think that'll just be interesting in itself how to play out. So I mean, I don't know, it may not be sort of like, I might not sort of like expect it to be sort of like the most sort of like craziest of seasons like we've had in the past, or especially like this one, as far as like, the large scale sort of like fights and all that sort of stuff. Could definitely be more of a interpersonal, sort of season or half season or however you want to sort of break it compared to the other ones, which I think might actually be, sort of good for some things, as long as it sort of keeps things sort of moving along, and they have sort of like the whole sort of like rebuilding sort of aspect here, and sort of how that all sort of gets made here. So no, there's definitely, I don't know, it definitely seems like this should be sort of like a fun sort of like season to see how things are progressing with our characters and get a lot more sort of like guess sort of personal moments with them. I think this would be the great time to sort of like do that without it seeming sort of like out of place, as we've seen in some other random episodes.
Yeah, like I think that's definitely a good idea. That just that them returning to the Galaxy Garrison and maybe potentially being involved in some training or some sparring, and them just being the Paladins just being so much better than the people who were like previously better than them, because like Lance, Hunk, Page were like sort of like bottom of their class, I think is the way we were meant to interpret it from their like the first
Yeah.
episode. So now they're coming in and they're like veteran of like X many battles, and like they're like potentially like the best pilots and really good at like actual just hand to hand like personal combat. That's going to be a really cool thing to just like they left, and like Shiro was kind of like that, but they're going to return and it's going to be like Shiro plus the whole team is kind of like that, and Keith especially is this kind of like ninja leader guy who's like older than when he left, and it's got. I think there's just going to be some fun moments for sure, and I hope they get it right. We don't know when season 7 is. There's been no date, whereas I think with season 5 they actually revealed the season 6 date with it. I assume one of the Comic Cons, SDCC or NYCC, will probably be when they reveal it. Since the show has kind of moved to this like 6-7 episode season format, there hasn't been any like super long break, but technically we probably should have a slightly longer one here, because it is a gap between like full production seasons rather than just like a half season thing. But I'd probably still suspect the next season to come sometime this year. Like it's probably be more towards the end of the year, but I still would suspect we'll get the next 6 episodes like November or December or something like that. But what's your guess for when season 7 will actually hit?
Yeah, I definitely could see the end of the year being more realistic as far as when we'd actually get something. I mean, I definitely can't, I wouldn't see like any sort of, I mean, maybe they could do an announcement at SDCC, but I could definitely see more of an announcement, or even like a real sort of like teaser or a trailer or something like that at NYCC. That seems like that would be more of the time scale for things that actually sort of happen as they have happened in the past. So that's what my guess would be.
So yeah, that's pretty much the end of the discussion. So yeah, we'll just end with some final thoughts on season 6. Personally, I really liked it. Obviously, I have some kind of minor issues with a little bit of kind of like each of the plots, just that detail wise they maybe didn't give us enough on some things. But I'm definitely open to like the upcoming seasons. Of course, there are certain other characters that are involved in these plots. They can reveal more details about them. But overall, I felt that most of the episodes were very impactful. They did like a handful of really like big things this season, with the Shiro plot, Keith and his mother, the Lotor kind of betrayal, the bring the romance kind of into things in a little bit more, and so on. There was a lot of great action this season that I really did like, and also that they've left the series in I think a really interesting place with the return to Earth as the setup for next season. So I really liked it. But Greg, what are your final thoughts on season 6?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it definitely was one of my more favorite sort of seasons so far that they have put together. I think, despite maybe one sort of weaker episode, I think overall it's sort of helped up as far as moving the story forward, and as far as, moving our characters to sort of different places, and just sort of, setting up the whole sort of like return to Earth, as well as just the whole, good sort of like set pieces, and just sort of, I don't know. I think everything, just the team in general, I think definitely sort of flowed better in this season, and just getting the number of reveals that we did actually get in this in this season, I think was definitely sort of like worth sort of like waiting this long to actually sort of get them, so that you actually at least have an idea of how everything has sort of happened. It feels like most things have been have come to the point now where you actually can sort of like get behind most things.
Hmm. But yeah, that's been the Voltron Online podcast for Season 6. The next Voltron podcast will obviously be when Season 7 hits. We'll come back and do a review for those 6 or 7 episodes, how many there are. And yeah, that's the way we'll continue to do things. Next week's podcast, or in 2 weeks' time, more than likely, we'll be doing an Avatar podcast to catch up with a little bit of the news that's happened, and maybe do some more predictions on what we think will happen at the conventions for Avatar and Korra. But yeah, that's been the Voltron Online podcast. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.
Bye bye.